On a gray afternoon when the rain fell in thin, patient lines, Ethan Brooks stood outside a house he had not visited in years, holding a worn leather box against his chest, like something fragile enough to break with a single wrong movement. He had driven more than 3 hours to get there, and every mile had felt heavier than the last. He only wanted to return what belonged to a man who could no longer ask for it back. But when the door finally opened, it was not the face he expected. It was Claire, the woman he had loved in silence a lifetime ago. Before grief and distance had quietly buried everything between them. Neither of them spoke at first. The rain kept falling, and somewhere inside that box lay a truth neither one of them was ready to hold. The road leading into the small town had not changed in 19 years, though everything around it seemed smaller now. As if time itself had shrunk the world Ethan once knew. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles pale, his eyes fixed on the wet asphalt ahead. In the passenger seat sat the leather box, tied with a strip of brown twine, its corners worn soft from being opened and closed 1,000 times before it ever reached him. Daniel had given it to him 14 months earlier, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet endings, and he had asked for only one thing in return. "If I'm ever gone," Daniel had said, his voice thin but steady, "bring it back to my family. Don't wait too long, Ethan. Promises get heavier the longer you carry them." Ethan had waited far longer than he intended. Guilt had a way of turning simple tasks into mountains. And for 14 months he told himself it wasn't the right time, that grief needed room to breathe, that showing up too soon might reopen wounds that were still trying to close. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. He wasn't ready to face the people who reminded him of everything he had lost and everything he had never said. The wipers moved back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm, and somewhere beneath that sound, he could still hear Daniel's laugh, warm and easy, the way it had always been for more than 2 decades of friendship. Twice during those 14 months, he had loaded the box into his car with every intention of finally making the drive. And twice he had carried it back inside before reaching the end of his own street, telling himself the timing wasn't right, that he needed one more week to prepare himself. He kept the box on a shelf in his closet, half hidden behind winter coats, as though putting it out of sight might also put the promise out of mind. It never worked. Some mornings he would wake already thinking of Daniel's voice, asking him to keep his word. And by evening the guilt would settle so heavily in his chest that sleep refused to come easily. They had met in college, 2 boys from different worlds who somehow understood each other without needing many words. Daniel was the one who filled silences with jokes. Ethan was the one who filled silences with steadiness. Over the years, that friendship had survived job losses, late-night arguments, one broken engagement, and eventually, a marriage that Ethan entered and a wife he buried far too soon. Through it all, Daniel remained the one constant, the one person who never asked Ethan to explain his silences, because he already understood them. The car slowed as it turned onto a familiar street lined with maple trees, their leaves dark and heavy with rain. The house at the end of the road looked exactly as Ethan remembered it. White shutters, a porch swing that still creaked in the wind, a mailbox shaped like a small red barn. He parked across the street and sat there for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, his hands trembling slightly against his knees. Then he stepped out into the rain, the box tucked beneath his coat, and walked toward the door, as though each step required a decision he had already made 1,000 times and still wasn't sure of. He knocked twice, then waited. Footsteps approached from somewhere inside, unhurried, almost hesitant. When the door opened, it was not Daniel's parents standing there, as he had expected. It was Claire, older now, her hair shorter, her eyes carrying a weight that had not been there the last time he saw her. For a moment, neither of them said a word. The rain fell steadily behind him, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and went quiet. "Ethan," she said finally. Her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and something gentler. "It's been a long time," he nodded, unable to find words that felt adequate. For a moment his eyes searched her face, tracing the small changes years had carved there, a faint line near her mouth, a tiredness around her eyes that had not existed the last time he saw her smile. She studied him in turn, noticing the gray now threading through his hair, the way his shoulders carried themselves a little more carefully than before, as though bracing against something invisible. Neither of them said any of this aloud. Some recognitions did not need words, only the quiet act of looking and being seen. She stepped aside without being asked, silently inviting him into the warmth of the house, and he crossed the threshold carrying more than just a box. Inside, the air smelled of cinnamon and old wood, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. A grandfather clock ticked somewhere down the hallway, its rhythm slow and steady, marking time the way it always had in this house. Indifferent to whoever came and went beneath its watch, she led him to the living room, gestured toward a chair, and finally let her eyes fall on the object beneath his arm. Her expression shifted the moment she recognized it, the color draining slightly from her face. "That box," she whispered, taking a step back as though it had suddenly grown heavier in the room. That box should have disappeared a long time ago. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a chair to steady herself, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the rain tapping softly against the window glass. Ethan set the box down gently on the coffee table, unsure whether to explain or simply wait for her to speak first. She stared at it the way someone might stare at an old photograph they had spent years trying to forget existed. He remembered, then, how close she had once been to her brother, how the two of them had shared secrets the way other siblings shared blood, deep and unspoken and permanent. Years ago, before marriages and funerals and long silences, Ethan had spent countless afternoons in this very house, sprawled across the porch steps while Daniel strummed an old guitar, and Claire laughed at something neither of them found particularly funny. She had been a college student then, always in motion, always smiling in that easy, unguarded way young people smile before life teaches them to guard themselves. Ethan had liked her long before he understood what liking someone truly meant, though he never once said it aloud. Daniel, of course, had known. "You two are going to end up together someday," Daniel used to tease, grinning as though he could see something neither of them could. "Mark my words, Ethan." Someday. Ethan had always laughed it off, mostly because admitting the truth felt like inviting complications neither he nor Claire were ready for. Then life moved forward the way it always does, indifferent to hesitation. Ethan married a woman named Sarah 2 years later, a kind, practical woman who filled his days with routine and quiet affection, if not the fire he once imagined loving someone might feel like. Claire, meanwhile, took a position in another state, chasing a career in architecture that left little room for looking backward. Letters became phone calls became occasional messages, and eventually even those faded into silence, the way most distances do when no one fights hard enough against them. Daniel's death had scattered what little remained. Sarah had passed 3 years before that, leaving Ethan alone in a house too quiet for comfort. And Daniel's decline afterward had happened faster than anyone expected, faster than anyone wanted to believe. Ethan hadn't been able to bring himself to attend every gathering afterward. Every awkward reunion of people bound only by shared grief. Claire, it seemed, had done the same. Now here they were, standing in the same room again after everything, brought together by a box neither of them had asked for. Claire moved toward the kitchen without a word, returning a few minutes later with 2 cups of tea, the steam curling upward between them like something trying to soften the tension in the room. They sat across from each other, the box resting untouched on the table, and for a while neither of them spoke. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I should have brought this sooner," he said. "I don't have a good excuse. I just didn't know how to face any of this." Claire studied him for a long moment before answering, her fingers wrapped tightly around her cup. "Maybe today is exactly when it was supposed to happen," she said quietly. "Some things don't come early or late. They come when we're finally ready to hold them." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded, watching the steam rise and disappear into the dim afternoon light. He noticed the way her hands wrapped around the warm cup, the same way they always had, fingers curling tightly as though the heat itself offered some small comfort against everything unspoken between them. Outside, the rain had softened into something quieter, a gentle patter against the window that filled the silence without demanding attention. Somewhere down the hallway, the old clock ticked on, indifferent to the years both of them had lost and the ones still waiting to be reclaimed. Claire's gaze drifted back to the box, and slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached out and untied the twine holding it closed. The leather creaked softly as the lid lifted, revealing the small collection of items Daniel had left behind, each one carrying a weight far heavier than its size suggested. Inside sat an old wristwatch, its leather band cracked with age, the glass face scratched from years of wear. Claire lifted it first, holding it gently between two fingers, as though it might still be ticking somewhere beneath the stillness, her thumb brushing lightly across the worn crystal. Beside it lay a worn brown wallet, its edges frayed, and a small leather-bound journal with a faded blue ribbon marking a page somewhere near the middle. Ethan recognized the wallet immediately. Remembering the countless times Daniel had pulled it out to cover a bill neither of them could quite afford in their younger years, always insisting it was his turn, even when it wasn't. At the very bottom, half hidden beneath a folded shirt, sat a single brass key, dulled with time but still catching the light when Claire lifted it into her palm. She turned it over slowly, her brow furrowing, her eyes narrowing the way they always did when something in her mind refused to settle into place. "Something's missing," she said suddenly, sifting through the contents again with growing urgency. "There's supposed to be an envelope. Daniel always kept an envelope with this box. I remember it clearly." Ethan leaned forward, checking the space beneath the journal, running his fingers along the lining of the box, as though the envelope might be hiding in some fold of fabric he had overlooked. There was nothing. Claire's eyes lifted to meet his, sharp now, searching. "Did you open this before you brought it here?" she asked, not unkindly, but with a firmness that demanded honesty. "Never," Ethan said immediately, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "I promised Daniel I wouldn't. I kept that promise, Claire. I swear it." She studied him for a long moment, as though weighing his words against years of accumulated grief and suspicion, then finally nodded, accepting the truth in his voice. Together they turned their attention to the journal, its pages filled with Daniel's uneven, slanted handwriting. Entries scattered across months, and sometimes years, thoughts recorded in the quiet hours when sleep refused to come. Claire flipped carefully through the pages until one entry, near the back, made her stop entirely. "If the letter is missing," Daniel had written, "then the truth isn't ready yet. Some things need the right moment to be found, not the moment we wish for." Claire read the line twice, her voice growing quieter with each pass, and Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, a mixture of confusion and something closer to dread. Whatever Daniel had been planning, it clearly involved more than a simple return of belongings. The brass key sat between them on the table, catching the gray afternoon light, and it was Ethan who finally noticed the small numbers stamped faintly along its edge, worn but still legible if you looked closely enough. 314, he read aloud, turning the key slowly in his fingers. Claire took it from him, examining it with the same careful attention she might give to a blueprint, tracing the shape of the numbers with her thumb. "It's not a house key," she murmured. "It's too small, too simple. This looks like it belongs to something else entirely." They sat with that thought for a long while, the tea growing cold between them, the rain outside slowing to a soft drizzle against the window pane. Ethan watched Claire's hands as she turned the key over again and again, and he remembered, suddenly, a place from years ago that used to have lockers stamped with numbers just like this one. "The old train station," he said slowly, almost to himself. "Before they renovated it, there used to be storage lockers along the back wall, past the ticket counter. Number 314. Daniel used one of them once, years ago, when we went on that trip to visit his cousin." Claire's eyes widened slightly, memory flickering behind them. "That's right," she whispered. "He kept forgetting his ticket. so he always used the same locker for anything important. I completely forgot about that place. Neither of them said much after that. There was an unspoken agreement forming between them, something neither wanted to name aloud. As though speaking, it might make the moment feel too large to carry. Claire stood first, grabbing her coat from the hook near the door, and Ethan followed without needing to be asked. The rain had softened into a mist by the time they stepped outside, gray light settling over the wet street, and the drive to the station passed mostly in silence, filled only by the occasional hum of tires against damp pavement, and the quiet weight of everything they weren't yet saying to each other. The train station had aged since either of them last saw it, its brick walls darker now, ivy climbing along one corner where renovations had clearly stalled years ago. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. The ticket counter long abandoned, though the storage lockers still stood exactly where memory placed them. A long row of dull metal doors lining the back wall. Claire walked ahead, her eyes scanning the numbers stamped above each door until she found it. Tucked near the far end, slightly rusted but intact, her hand trembled as she lifted the key toward the lock, and Ethan stood close behind her, close enough to notice the faint unevenness in her breathing. The key slid in with a soft click, resistant at first, then giving way as she turned it slowly. The door creaked open on hinges that hadn't moved in years, revealing a small wooden box tucked in the shadows. Its surface layered thin with dust. Claire lifted it carefully, cradling it the way someone might hold something they were afraid could shatter. Inside sat a handful of photographs, their edges curled with age, along with a single envelope sealed shut, yellowed slightly by time but otherwise untouched. Ethan reached over and gently brushed the dust from its surface, and together they read the words written across the front in Daniel's familiar, uneven handwriting. For Ethan and Claire, it read simply. The ink slightly faded but still clear enough to understand exactly what it meant. Claire's fingers hovered over the seal for a long moment before she finally broke it open, her breath catching as she unfolded the pages inside. The station around them stood mostly empty, save for a single pigeon shuffling along a rafter overhead and the distant, hollow sound of wind moving through a broken window somewhere near the old ticket booth. Ethan moved closer, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and together they began to read words Daniel had written years before either of them ever imagined standing in this station again. The handwriting was steady at first, careful, as though he had rewritten the opening more than once to get it right. Claire's eyes moved quickly across the first lines, then slowed, then stopped altogether, her lips parting slightly, as though the weight of what she read had momentarily taken her breath. Ethan watched her face, rather than the page for a moment, reading the emotion there before he allowed himself to return to the words. Whatever waited on that paper, it was already reshaping something between them, and neither of them dared to look away. "If you two are reading this together," Daniel had written, "then everything worked out exactly the way I hoped it would, even if it took far longer than I wanted." Claire's hand rose slowly to cover her mouth, and Ethan felt his chest tighten as he continued reading in silence beside her. Daniel wrote that he had known for years, long before either of them ever said a word to each other, that something quiet and real existed between them. He had watched it in the way Ethan lingered a little too long during goodbyes, in the way Claire's laughter changed whenever Ethan walked into a room. He had never pushed either of them to speak it aloud, believing, foolishly perhaps, that timing would eventually take care of itself. But timing never came, Daniel had written. "You both stayed silent, and I let you. Because I thought there would always be more time. I was wrong about that. And I'm sorry for how long I waited to write this down." Claire read the words twice, her eyes glistening under the dim station light, and Ethan felt something break open in his chest, something he had spent years trying to keep sealed. He remembered every moment he had almost said something and didn't, every dinner where the right words sat on his tongue before he swallowed them down out of fear or timing or simple cowardice. Claire's breath trembled as she turned to the next page, and neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavier now than it had ever been. "I always hoped you two would find your way to each other," Daniel continued, his handwriting growing slightly less steady toward the bottom of the page. "But I never told you why I hoped for it so much. There's something else I need you both to know, something I kept from everyone, including my own family." Claire lowered the letter slightly, her eyes lifting to meet Ethan's, both of them sensing that whatever came next would change something neither of them could yet name. The station around them felt suddenly smaller, the dust and shadows pressing closer, as though the building itself understood the weight of the words about to be read. Ethan reached out and gently steadied the page in Claire's trembling hands, and together they continued reading toward whatever truth Daniel had been carrying in silence for far longer than either of them ever imagined. "I was sick for almost 3 years before anyone knew," Daniel had written, his handwriting steadier now, as though this particular truth had been easier to put into words once he finally allowed himself to begin. "I kept it from everyone, even our parents, because I didn't want anyone treating me differently in whatever time I had left. I wanted normal conversations, normal arguments, normal laughter. I didn't want pity following me into every room." Claire's hand pressed against her chest as she read the line again, her breath uneven, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks without any attempt to stop them. Ethan stood beside her in silence, the womanberry elation settling slowly over him, reshaping years of memory in an instant. He thought back to the last few months of their friendship, the tired look in Daniel's eyes that he had dismissed as simple exhaustion, the weight loss he had blamed on stress. All of it made a terrible, quiet sense now. He remembered a phone call from almost 2 years earlier, Daniel's voice unusually quiet, asking Ethan strange, distant questions about what he thought happened after people were gone, whether he believed anything of a person truly lasted. At the time, Ethan had brushed it off as one of Daniel's late-night philosophical moods, the kind he sometimes fell into after a long day. Now the memory returned with a different weight entirely, each word rearranging itself into something far more deliberate than he had ever realized. "This box was never really about returning old belongings," Daniel continued. "I built this whole thing so that eventually, when I was gone, you two would be forced to face each other again. I knew neither of you would do it on your own. You're both too stubborn, too careful, too afraid of disturbing something that already felt broken." Claire let out a small, broken laugh through her tears, shaking her head slightly as she read the next line aloud, her voice cracking halfway through the sentence. "If you two are standing together right now, reading this, then my last plan actually worked," Daniel had written. "And honestly, that might be the thing I'm proudest of in this entire life." Ethan felt his own eyes sting. A lifetime of controlled composure, finally slipping loose in the quiet corner of an abandoned train station. Claire wiped at her cheeks with the sleeve of her coat, laughing softly even as fresh tears continued to fall, the sound somewhere between grief and disbelief, and something warmer underneath it all. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly between them, the weight of Daniel's final gift settling into the space between two people who had spent years pretending distance didn't hurt. At the very bottom of the page, beneath his signature, Daniel had written a final line, almost like an afterthought, though nothing about this letter had been accidental. A set of coordinates followed, numbers precise and deliberate, clearly marking a location neither of them immediately recognized. Claire pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, entering the numbers slowly, watching as the map resolved into a familiar shape neither of them had seen in years, a small property near the edge of a lake they both remembered far too well. "The lake house," she whispered, lifting her eyes to meet Ethan's. "He wants us to go there." The drive to the lake took nearly an hour, the roads narrowing gradually from highway to gravel as trees closed in on either side, their branches heavy with rain that had finally begun to ease. Neither of them spoke much along the way, though the silence no longer felt uncomfortable the way it had earlier that day. It felt instead like two people quietly preparing themselves for something they both sensed was waiting at the end of the road. The cabin appeared exactly as memory had preserved it. Weathered wood siding, a crooked chimney, a dock stretching out over water gone still and silver beneath the clouded sky. Ethan parked the car and sat for a moment, looking at the place where three friends had once spent countless summers fishing until sunset, laughing over nothing, believing foolishly that time would always stretch endlessly ahead of them. Claire stepped out first, her eyes tracing the porch, the door, the window where a curtain still hung slightly crooked from years ago. Inside, dust coated every surface, though little else had changed. A stack of fishing rods leaned against the far wall, untouched since the last visit any of them had made. Sunlight filtered weakly through curtains gone thin with age, catching the dust suspended in the air like tiny, drifting embers. Somewhere outside, a loon called once across the water, its cry echoing thin and lonely over the still surface of the lake. And for a moment, both of them simply stood there, listening, letting the sound settle over the room, like a held breath finally released. Claire moved toward an old wooden dresser near the window, opening one drawer after another until she found what she was searching for. A thick photo album, bound in faded green cloth, its pages slightly warped from years of humidity. She sat down slowly at the small kitchen table, opening the album with careful hands, and Ethan pulled a chair beside her, close enough that their knees nearly touched beneath the table. Page after page revealed photographs neither of them had seen before. Images Daniel had apparently taken in secret over the years, capturing moments neither Ethan nor Claire had realized were being documented at all. There were photographs of Claire laughing on the dock, unaware of the camera, her hair caught mid-toss by the wind. There were photographs of Ethan watching her from a distance, his expression soft in a way he had never allowed himself to notice before. Claire's fingers traced the edge of one photograph, her voice barely above a whisper. "He knew," she said quietly. "He knew for years. And he never said a word to either of us." Ethan studied the photograph in silence, something warm and aching spreading slowly through his chest. He thought of all the years lost to hesitation, to timing, to the quiet fear of disrupting something fragile before it had even begun. Claire closed the album gently, resting her hand on its cover, her eyes drifting toward the window where the lake stretched gray and still beneath the fading afternoon light. For a while they simply sat together, sharing stories neither of them had spoken aloud in years. Memories surfacing one after another, like stones rising slowly from beneath still water. Claire recalled summers filled with laughter, and Ethan remembered evenings spent listening to Daniel's endless, terrible jokes around a fire that never quite caught properly. Somewhere in the retelling, the distance between them began to soften, replaced by something gentler, something neither of them had expected to feel again after so many years of silence. Eventually, Claire turned toward him, her eyes searching his face with a quiet, careful honesty that hadn't been there earlier in the day. "If he had said something back then," she asked softly, "do you think things would have turned out differently?" Ethan's throat tightened at the question, the weight of years pressing down on a single sentence he had never allowed himself to speak aloud. He looked out toward the lake, watching the water ripple faintly beneath a passing breeze, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, gathering the courage to finally answer a question he had avoided for most of his adult life. "I thought about telling you," he admitted finally, his voice low and steady despite the tremor beneath it. "More than once. But I convinced myself you deserve someone better than a man too afraid to say what he actually felt. So, I said nothing. And then life moved forward without waiting for either of us to catch up." Claire listened quietly, her eyes never leaving his face. And when he finished speaking, she nodded slowly, as though something long unspoken between them had finally found its shape. She told him then about the years following his marriage, how she had quietly hoped, for longer than she wanted to admit, that circumstances might someday change. Eventually, she convinced herself he was happy, that whatever she once felt belonged to a version of both of them that no longer existed. "We were both waiting for the other person to be brave first," she said softly, a faint, sad smile touching the corner of her mouth. "And neither of us ever was." Ethan reached across the table, his hand resting gently near hers, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin without yet closing the distance completely. "My marriage was good," he said quietly, choosing his words with care. "Sarah was kind, and I loved her in the way life allowed me to. But there was always a part of me that stayed quiet, a door I never fully opened, even to her. After she passed, I told myself I was done trying to open anything again." Claire's fingers moved slowly, closing the remaining distance between their hands, her touch light but certain. "I felt the same way after everything with Daniel," she admitted. "I convinced myself it was easier to stay closed off than to risk losing something else I couldn't bear to lose again." She was quiet for a moment, her thumb tracing small, absent circles across the back of his hand, as though the motion itself helped her find the courage to keep speaking. "There were nights I almost called you," she admitted softly. "After Daniel passed, I would sit with the phone in my hand for an hour, and then I'd put it down again, telling myself it wasn't my place, that too much time had already gone by." Ethan listened without interrupting, his chest tightening at the thought of all those unanswered moments stacking quietly between them, invisible to each other, and yet somehow shared all along. "I wish you had called," he said finally, his voice rough with something he hadn't expected to feel. "I think I was waiting for the same kind of courage." Claire's eyes lifted to his, glistening but steady, and for the first time that day, neither of them looked away. Outside, the last of the rain finally stopped, leaving behind a stillness so complete that even the water on the lake seemed to hold its breath. Neither of them moved to break the silence that followed, both of them simply sitting there, hands finally joined after years of distance, allowing the moment to settle over them without rushing toward whatever came next. They stayed at the lake house well into the evening, and by the time they finally locked the door behind them, something quiet and unspoken had shifted between them, gentle but unmistakable. Over the following weeks, they returned several times, slowly working through the tasks Daniel had left behind, sorting through boxes of old letters, faded photographs, and small mementos scattered throughout the property, like pieces of a life waiting patiently to be gathered. Claire took charge of organizing Daniel's personal writings, carefully separating pages meant for family from those meant for no one but himself. She worked slowly, often pausing over a sentence for minutes at a time, reading it twice before allowing herself to move forward, as though rushing might mean missing something important hidden between the lines. Ethan handled the practical matters, contacting the local historical society about donating several items connected to Daniel's community work, arranging for a modest display that would preserve his memory for people who had known him only briefly, if at all. Together, they visited Daniel's parents, Robert and Margaret, helping the older couple sort through decades of accumulated life, offering steady hands during moments that often grew too heavy for words. Robert rarely spoke during those visits, preferring instead to stand quietly near the window with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, watching the two of them work through boxes that held pieces of the son he still could not quite believe he had lost. Margaret, on the other hand, talked constantly, filling silences with stories neither Ethan nor Claire had heard before, small memories that made Daniel feel present in the room even though his chair by the fireplace remained empty. Margaret watched the two of them quietly one afternoon, as they carried boxes out to a waiting car, her eyes soft with something that looked almost like relief. She said nothing directly, though the small, knowing smile she offered Claire before they left spoke volumes neither of them needed translated. Slowly, without either of them fully announcing it, Ethan and Claire became something steady for each other, a quiet presence neither had realized they were missing until it settled back into place. There was no single moment when it happened, no dramatic turn or sudden declaration, only a gradual accumulation of small things. A shared glance across a cluttered room, a hand offered without needing to be asked for, a silence that no longer felt like distance but like comfort. Claire began smiling more easily, her laughter returning in small, unguarded moments that reminded Ethan of summers long past. Ethan, in turn, found himself sleeping easier, the guilt he had carried for over a year finally beginning to loosen its grip on his chest. They spent evenings at the lake house repairing an old fence, evenings in Claire's kitchen sharing simple meals, evenings simply sitting together in comfortable silence that no longer needed filling with explanation. One evening, as autumn settled over the town and the leaves outside turned the color of dying fire, Ethan sat across from Claire at her kitchen table, watching her sort through a final stack of Daniel's letters. Before he stood to leave that night, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, turning it slowly between his fingers before setting it gently on the table between them. Claire looked up, her eyes moving from his face to the box and back again, her breath catching somewhere in her throat. "Not tonight," Ethan said quietly, a faint smile touching his lips. "But someday, when the timing feels right. I don't want to wait as long as I did before." Claire's fingers reached out, resting lightly on top of the box without opening it. her eyes glistening beneath the warm kitchen light. "Some promises," she said softly, "are worth waiting for the right moment." A full year passed before Ethan and Claire returned together to the house where their story had truly begun again. The same white shutters, the same creaking porch swing, though the season had changed from cold rain to golden autumn light filtering gently through the trees. Claire stood on the porch steps, watching Ethan walk toward her from the car, and something in his expression told her this visit carried more weight than any of the ones before it. He reached into his coat pocket, his hand steady this time. No hesitation lingering in his movements, the way it once had. A breeze moved gently through the yard, lifting a scatter of dry leaves across the porch steps, and somewhere down the street a dog barked once before falling quiet again, the same small, ordinary sound that had greeted Ethan on the day this whole story began. Claire's eyes filled with tears before he even spoke, as though some part of her had already known this moment was coming, had been quietly waiting for it, the same way she had waited for so many things over the years. Ethan knelt slowly on the wooden porch, the velvet box open in his palm, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "I spent years afraid of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time," he said softly. "I'm done waiting for perfect timing, Claire. I just want to spend whatever time we have left being brave enough to say exactly what I feel, every single day." Claire's answer came through tears and laughter tangled together, her hands cupping his face as she nodded, unable to find words steady enough to match the moment. Later that afternoon, they drove together to the quiet cemetery where Daniel rested beneath a maple tree that had grown taller than either of them remembered, its leaves scattering gently across the grass in soft shades of amber and gold. Ethan placed a small bundle of white flowers against the headstone, kneeling for a long moment in silence before finally speaking, his voice quiet but clear in the stillness of the afternoon air. "You kept your promise," he said softly, his fingers brushing lightly against the cool stone. "Even after everything, you found a way to bring us back together." Claire knelt beside him, resting her hand gently over his, her eyes glistening as she looked toward the maple tree swaying softly above them. "He didn't just return a friend's belongings," she said quietly, her voice trembling with quiet gratitude. "He gave us back the future we almost let slip away." They stayed there a while longer, hand in hand, the wind moving gently through the branches above, carrying with it something that felt, at last, like peace. Claire rested her head against Ethan's shoulder, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, listening instead to the soft rustle of leaves and the distant, ordinary sound of birds settling into the trees for the evening. It was a small, quiet moment, unremarkable in almost every way, and yet it held more comfort than either of them had known in years. When they finally rose and walked back toward the car, the late afternoon sun broke fully through the clouds, spilling warm golden light across the quiet cemetery grounds behind them. Ethan glanced once more toward the maple tree, its branches swaying gently, before opening the car door for Claire the way he always did now, a small habit that had become second nature somewhere along the way. Neither of them looked back, though both of them carried Daniel with them, not as a weight any longer, but as the quiet, unseen hand that had guided them home. And somewhere beyond the reach of grief and years lost to silence, it felt as though he was finally, truly, at rest.